We often talk about the pandemic costs, don't we? Those huge numbers, the stimulus, the furlough scheme.
Billions, trillions globally. It's easy to get lost in those initial figures.
Exactly. Hundreds of billions just here in the UK. But a lot of that was, well, kind of one-off, wasn't it? Emergency spending?
That's right. Necessary at the time, absolutely, but not recurring in the same way.
So today we're doing a deep dive into something slightly different, maybe more critical now. What's the ongoing cost? The permanent price tag the UK economy is still paying year in, year out.
Yeah, we're moving past that initial shock phase. We need
Right.
to analyze the lasting structural damage, the economic scar, if you like.
A scar that keeps costing us.
Precisely. And this deep dive, it's really for you if you need to understand why today's economic picture is so different from pre-2020. It's not just about what happened, but the lingering effects.
Our mission, then, is to try and quantify this persistent drag, this structural thing you mentioned.
Exactly. We're pulling together analysis, from government bodies, academic studies,
Yeah.
trying to pin down these recurring liabilities, the hit to productive capacity. Analysts are pegging this in the tens of billions every year.
Okay, tens of billions annually.
Right.
Right. Let's unpack that. We need to be really clear on the terms here for you listening. We're separating two things, aren't we?
We absolutely have to. First, there's the initial shock.
Okay.
Think of that as the massive economic heart attack in 2020. The GDP collapse, the scramble for support, the furlough scheme everyone remembers. Huge, acute, but largely contained within that period.
Right, the emergency room phase.
Mhm.
407 billion in direct support, figures like that, one-off injections.
Yes. And then distinct from that is what we're calling the structural drag, or the scarring.
Okay, the scarring. So that's the long-term condition after leaving the hospital.
That's a good way to put it. It's the chronic condition the economy is left with. And it's got two main parts. First, there are recurring sort of higher fiscal liabilities. Mostly that means paying the interest on all the money borrowed during the shock. That cost doesn't just disappear.
Right, the debt servicing.
Exactly. And second, and this is crucial, there's a potentially permanent reduction in the economy's ability to produce things, its productive capacity,
How so?
mainly through damage to the workforce, health impacts, people leaving the labor market. We'll get into that. But essentially, the economy's engine isn't firing on all cylinders anymore.
Okay, so it's a fiscal hole and a sort of capacity problem. And that's what adds up to this annual bill.
That's what we're trying to quantify. The annual hole in the national accounts that now exists because of these shifts. A hole that needs filling through policy every single year.
Right, so to really get our heads around this recurring scar, this drag, we probably need to start with the scale of the initial wound, don't we? The shock itself.
Absolutely. You need the context because the 2020 contraction wasn't just a normal recession. It was something else entirely.
Yeah, I remember the figures. They were just staggering.
They still are. Looking back, UK GDP fell by 11.0% in 2020. 11%.
Which is huge for a developed economy in 1 year.
It's monumental. Our sources, they consistently highlight this point. It was the steepest single-year drop since,
Okay.
wait for it, 1709.
1709, seriously.
Seriously.
Wow. What even happened in 1709?
The Great Frost, a massive continent-wide climate event, famine, agricultural collapse, a totally external physical disaster.
Okay, so comparing 2020 to that, a modern service-based economy grinding to a halt on that scale, what does that tell us? Even if the halt was, mandated for public health.
It tells us the nature of the shock was fundamentally different. 2008, the financial crisis, that was about credit freezing up, demand collapsing. Bad, but different.
Right.
2020 was supply and demand hitting a wall simultaneously because we literally switched off large pulse of the economy.
Turned off the lights.
Pretty much. And the data from the peak of the first lockdown, April to June 2020, shows that GDP fell in that quarter by a record 19.4%.
Just stop
Yeah.
breathing, like you said.
Exactly. The economy just ceased functioning in many areas.
And faced with that kind of collapse, I mean, the government had to step in massively, right, to prevent total meltdown, insolvencies, mass unemployment.
Absolutely no question. The risk of a complete downward spiral was very real. And the sheer scale of that necessary intervention is what forged this debt anchor we're talking about.
The anchor that's now causing the drag.
Precisely. That total direct UK spending, the furlough, grants, loans, all of it came to around $407 billion.
407 billion. How does that compare, say, to the 2008 response? just for context.
It dwarfs it in terms of direct government spending relative to the size of the economy. 2008 was more about bank bailouts and comparatively smaller stimulus packages. This was direct support on an unprecedented scale.
Okay, so that spending, it saved jobs, kept businesses afloat, definitely. But the bill arrived.
It arrived. The coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough, that alone was about $70 billion. Huge chunk of the total.
So how did paying that immediate bill morph into this a permanent structural problem?
Yeah.
Where's the connection?
It's simple, really. Debt. Almost all of that $407 billion was borrowed money,
Right.
which blew the annual budget deficit up to a level that sounds almost unreal. $394 billion in the fiscal year 2020-21.
$394 billion deficit
Let's see.
in 1 year.
Yep. That works out at about 19% of GDP. 19%.
Wow. What's the comparison point for that?
You have to go back to World War II. That's
Yeah.
the only time the UK borrowed that much relative to its economy in a single year.
Okay, so wartime levels of borrowing, that really frames it.
It does. And that single year of massive borrowing, it fundamentally changed the UK's balance sheet for the long term. It pushed a total public sector net debt, the accumulated borrowing, up over 100% of GDP.
And that's the key level, 100%.
It's a significant threshold, psychologically and fiscally, and we hadn't been consistently above that level since the 1950s when the country was still paying off the actual war debt.
So that's the debt anchor.
That's a debt anchor. The acute borrowing shock transformed into a persistent structural fiscal challenge because a higher debt level means inescapably higher debt interest payments year after year, indefinitely.
So every year now, the government starts deeper in the hole, just servicing that bigger pile of debt before it even thinks about new spending.
That's it. That higher baseline cost is a core part of the annual structural drag we're trying to nail down today.
Okay, so we have this huge debt anchor leading to higher baseline costs. Which brings us, I think, to a really tricky question, one you listening are probably asking right now. How much of this damage, this cost, was actually caused by the virus itself versus the government's response, the lockdowns, the restrictions?
Yes, the attribution challenge. It's maybe the most complex piece of this entire puzzle. Did the cure cause more harm than the disease, economically speaking?
Yeah, because if the lockdowns, the mandates, made the economic hit worse than it might have been otherwise, doesn't that mean the policy itself was, well, damaging, at least in purely economic terms?
It's the central question the source material really grapples with. And look, the academic modeling is pretty clear on one thing. The immediate policy response, the full lockdown strategy, did result in a bigger measured drop in GDP compared to, say, theoretical alternatives.
Okay, do we have numbers on that? What did the models show?
They do give estimates. Several studies suggested that the kind of comprehensive suppression strategy the UK used, full lockdowns, was linked to a GDP loss of around 22% during the peak periods.
72% loss, okay. And the alternative, less restrictive.
The models looked at hypothetical mitigation strategies, maybe fewer restrictions, more targeted measures, relying more on voluntary changes. Those were predicted to lead to maybe a 13.5% GDP loss.
Right, so the difference there is, what, 8.5 percentage points of GDP?
Roughly, yes.
That sounds significant. On paper, that looks like the lockdown policy added 8.5 points to the economic pain. Billions of pounds extra in lost output immediately.
If you only look at that one number, yes, it could seem like a straightforward indictment of the policy choice.
But there's always a but.
There's a crucial but. These complex models, the ones trying to simulate both the economy and the pandemic spread, they add a really important layer of nuance.
Which is?
They strongly suggest that a big chunk of the economic decline would have happened anyway, even without government mandates.
Oh, why?
Voluntary suppression, fear, risk aversion. Think about it. Even if shops and restaurants were technically open, would millions of people have flocked to them during the peak of an uncontrolled pandemic?
Probably not. You'd see people staying home, avoiding crowds, cutting spending, canceling travel.
Yeah.
Just out of self-preservation or concern.
Exactly. The models estimate that this voluntary behavioral change could account for maybe up to 2/3 of the total economic slowdown. People would have partially locked down themselves.
Okay, so the government mandates the lockdowns. They didn't create all the economic pain from scratch. They maybe amplified it, concentrated it, made it more official.
Codified it, perhaps accelerated it, pulled the pain forward. But the underlying reason for the contraction, the uncontrolled virus posing a massive threat, was still there. Attributing the full 22% loss just to the policy is likely inaccurate.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't a choice between lockdown and a booming economy. It was a choice between lockdown and Something else, likely still very bad economically, plus potentially catastrophic health outcomes.
And that leads us to the absolutely critical other side of the coin here, the counterpoint. What did the policy prevent? What was the non-fiscal benefit?
The averted catastrophe.
Precisely. We have to try and put an economic value, however difficult that is, on what didn't happen because of the intervention.
Which would?
Primarily the complete collapse of the NHS. An overwhelmed health service, unable to treat not just COVID patients, but anyone, would have led to mass mortality on a scale far beyond what we saw.
And the economic consequences of that scenario.
Devastating. Societal breakdown, loss of confidence, potentially years, maybe decades, of economic stagnation. Far, far worse than the sharp, policy-induced GDP drop we actually experienced.
Okay, so how do analysts even begin to put a number on avoiding that? Valuing lives saved, essentially.
They use a specific, standardized tool. It's called the value of a prevented fatality, or VPF.
VPF. Okay, what is that?
It's a metric used by governments, including the UK Treasury in its official Green Book for Policy Appraisal, to assign a monetary value to reducing the risk of death. It's used for things like justifying road safety improvements or health interventions.
So it's a way to compare the cost of a policy against the monetary value of the lives it's expected to save.
Essentially, yes. It tries to capture society's willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk. It's controversial, ethically complex, of course, but it's a standard tool in policy analysis.
Right. So first step, estimate how many lives were actually saved by the lockdown policy compared to, say, just letting the virus rip or using milder measures.
Correct. Analysis comparing the suppression strategy to a theoretical mitigation-only approach calculated that the policy shift prevented approximately 159,000 incremental deaths.
159,000 lives. That's a huge number.
It is. And these aren't just statistics. They represent workers, consumers, family members, human capital preserved.
Okay, so 159,000 lives saved. Now, what's the VPF figure the UK Treasury actually uses to multiply that by?
The standard UK Treasury VPF used in these calculations is £2 million per prevented fatality.
£2 million per life.
Yes. Again, economists debate whether this is too high, too low, or even appropriate, but for justifying policy within the government's own framework, that's the number.
Okay, so 159,000 lives saved times £2 million each. What gives us?
A calculated total social value of the fatalities prevented in the range of 318 billion to 318 billion pounds, minimum. Yes. The higher end of the range includes deaths averted indirectly, like fewer traffic accidents because everyone was home. But the core figure is around 318 billions just from directly preventing COVID deaths through the policy.
Right. Let's put that next to the cost.
Right.
We said earlier the additional immediate economic cost of the lockdown policy compared to doing less was maybe around 110 billion in lost GDP.
Correct.
So the analysis suggests the benefit of avoiding 318 billion worth of catastrophe massively outweighed the immediate extra cost of 110 billion.
By a factor of almost 3 to 1, the synthesis is pretty stark. The intervention cost, that extra GDP hit, was large, yes, but it was significantly less than the monetized value of the lives saved.
Were there other benefits calculated too?
Yes. The analysis also factored in things like an estimated 33 billion in direct healthcare savings from preventing the NHS being totally overwhelmed, plus the value of preserving quality of life measured in something called quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. About 3.17 million QALYs were estimated to have been saved.
Okay, so pulling it all together, we took a big, sharp economic hit in 2020, maybe 110 billion, bigger than if we'd done less. But we did that to avoid a 318 billion plus catastrophe in terms of lives lost, not to mention the NHS collapse.
That's the economic justification presented in the analysis. The policy response, despite its immediate cost, was deemed rational from this perspective.
But, and here's a link back to our main topic, the legacy of making that choice, of taking that 110 billion hit and borrowing massively to cushion it, is the structural scarring we're now paying for annually.
Exactly. The debt anchor, the potential damage to productive capacity, those are the enduring consequences. The price we pay year after year for having averted that initial 318 billion disaster.
Right. So that debt anchor we established, that's the legacy event. Now we need to really focus on the recurring costs, the structural drag, starting with the fiscal side of it, the hole in the government's budget. Where do we get the best sort of official measure of how big that permanent hole is?
For that, we really have to turn to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR.
The independent forecaster.
Exactly. Their job is to crunch the numbers and give an impartial assessment of the public finances. And their analysis, post-pandemic, consistently identified a significant, persistent structural hole, a gap that remains even after the economy bounced back initially.
Okay, why?
Hmm.
Why didn't borrowing just snap back to normal pre-pandemic levels once the emergency spending stopped? Why is there a structural hole?
That's the key question. And the answer is sort of twofold. First, the crisis seems to have permanently, or at least very long-term, damaged the UK's potential growth rate. The economy's underlying capacity to generate tax revenue is just lower than we thought it would be back in 2019.
So less income for the government permanently.
Yes. And second, on the other side of the ledger, the crisis led to permanent increases in expected government spending.
How so? Didn't the emergency schemes end?
The big ones did, yes. But the crisis exposed and exacerbated underlying pressures. Think about the NHS, huge waiting lists requiring ongoing extra funding. Think about social care needs, maybe higher spending on sickness and disability benefits due to long-term health impacts. Plus, just the general upward creep in departmental budgets that often happens after a massive crisis response. Certain spending levels become normalized.
Okay, so the economy's earning potential is lower, and the government's baseline spending needs are higher compared to the pre-2020 path.
Precisely. Less money coming in, more locked-in spending going out. That creates a permanent structural gap, a mismatch.
And the OBR put a number on how big that gap is, how much adjustment is needed just to get back to a stable footing.
They did. They calculated that even to meet a fairly standard definition of fiscal stability, basically, getting day-to-day spending covered by tax receipts, not counting investment, a mandatory permanent fiscal adjustment would be needed every single year.
An adjustment meaning
What?
tax rises or spending cuts.
Exactly. It's the amount of consolidation, the policy action required annually just to stop the underlying debt ratio from rising indefinitely. This isn't a gap that will close on its own with a bit of economic luck. It needs active intervention.
Okay, the crucial figure. What did the OBR estimate this mandatory annual structural fiscal cost to be?
Their key estimate was for an annual fiscal adjustment of £27 billion. That's 27 billion per year, equating to roughly 1% of GDP that would be required by the mid-2020s, say 2025, 26, just to stabilize the underlying finances.
27 billion pounds.
Yeah.
Every single year.
Every single year.
Let's just pause on that. What does that 27 billion pound really represent?
Yeah.
Is it mostly paying the interest on the COVID debt, or is it these higher spending pressures you mentioned?
It's a mix, but it's defined as the policy action needed. So it's the size of the tax rises or spending cuts required to fill the gap. The OBR's analysis suggested maybe around a third of that structural deficit came from the permanently lower growth forecasts, the lower tax receipts. And the other two-thirds or so stemmed from those higher structural spending pressures, the NHS backlog, potentially higher welfare spending due to health issues, maybe some defense spending increases, and just that general post-crisis baseline shift.
So this 27 billion pound, it's basically the minimum annual price tag for the fiscal scar. It has to be found one way or another. Either taxes stay higher by 1% of GDP forever compared to pre-crisis plans, or public spending is cut by 27 billion relative to those plans continuously.
That's exactly what it signifies. It anchors the ongoing structural cost firmly in the tens of billions. It's the non-negotiable starting point for understanding the annual burden.
Okay, that's a huge concrete number.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the debt servicing cost earlier. Is that separate from this 27 billion, or is it part of it? And you mentioned volatility.
Right. This leads to the second major fiscal vulnerability. The debt level is high, contributing to that 27 billion gap. But the structure of UK debt adds another layer of cost and, importantly, volatility.
The structure.
Ah,
How so?
yeah. This is a really critical point and something that makes the UK situation a bit different from some other countries that also borrowed heavily. It's about our reliance on index-linked gilts.
Index-linked gilts. Okay, explain those. How are they different from a normal government bond?
A standard government bond pays a fixed interest rate on the amount borrowed. Simple enough. Index-linked gilts, however, are different. Both the principal amount you get back at the end and the regular interest payments are adjusted upwards in line with inflation.
Ah, so the amount the government has to repay and the interest it pays along the way goes up if inflation goes up.
Precisely. And crucially, in the UK, these gilts are historically linked to the Retail Prices Index, RPI measure of inflation.
RPI, which tends to run higher than CPI, the more common measure.
Often, yes. And the UK has, for various historical reasons, issued a much higher proportion of its total government debt in this index-linked form compared to most other major economies.
Why? Why did we do that? Sounds incredibly risky now, looking back at the recent inflation spike.
Well, the strategy goes back to the 1980s. At the time, they were seen as a way to attract certain types of investors, like pension funds, who really wanted inflation protection for the long term. It was also maybe seen as a sign of the government's confidence in keeping inflation low.
Didn't quite work out that way recently.
Not at all. The post-pandemic inflation surge, which pushed RPI inflation much higher than anyone expected for a while, dramatically exposed this structural choice as a major vulnerability.
So high inflation wasn't just hitting households. It was directly, automatically, and massively increasing the government's debt interest bill because of these RPI-linked bonds.
Exactly. It became a sort of self-inflicted accelerator on debt costs. Every percentage point rise in RPI immediately triggered billions more in interest payments that the Treasury simply had to find. It wasn't discretionary.
Billions. Do we have examples of how much?
Oh, yes. During the peak inflation periods, the OBR reported jumps in the forecast for debt interest payments of billions, sometimes tens of billions, almost overnight, purely because RPI forecasts were revised upwards. You'd see figures like an extra £3.8 billion needed in a specific period just due to higher RPI.
Wow. So this isn't just part of the baseline $27 billion structural gap. It's an additional volatile cost layered on top.
It contributes to the overall pressure driving that $27 billion gap, yes, because higher average debt servicing costs are baked in. But the volatility is the extra dimension here. It makes fiscal planning incredibly difficult because a sudden jump in inflation can blow forecasts out of the water.
Right. So the $27 billion is the steady underlying structural adjustment needed. But the index-linked debt adds this unpredictable multi-billion-pound potential shock on top, year after year, depending on inflation. It reinforces the permanence and the riskiness of that debt overhang.
Perfectly put. It's a major ongoing fiscal headache directly stemming from the crisis borrowing interacting with the specific structure of UK debt.
Okay, so we've got the direct treasury cost pretty clear now, the $27 billion structural hole, plus the volatile debt interest kicker. But you said earlier the drag wasn't just fiscal. We need to shift focus now, right, to the damaged end of the economy's actual engine, its ability to produce.
Absolutely. This is the other major component of the annual SCAR. We need to move from the exchequer spreadsheets to, well, the health and capacity of the workforce, the human capital cost.
And this is where the issue of long COVID comes in, not just as a health crisis, but as a measurable macroeconomic problem.
Yes, precisely. It's become clear that long COVID isn't just a personal tragedy for those affected. It's acting as a significant ongoing drag on the UK's labor supply and therefore its potential GDP.
How? What's the mechanism?
It's quite direct. If large numbers of people are suffering from chronic symptoms that prevent them from working or force them to reduce their hours or work less productively, well, the total amount of work getting done in the economy shrinks.
Less output, smaller economic pie.
Exactly. It's a direct constraint on labor participation and productivity.
So how big is this problem in the UK? Do we have solid numbers on how many people are affected in a way that impacts their work?
The data, primarily from the Office for National Statistics, ONS, paints a concerning picture. By early 2023, estimates suggested around 1.9 million people in the UK were reporting long COVID symptoms lasting more than a few weeks.
1.9 million? That's a lot of people. Are they mostly older, retired people, or?
That's the worrying part for the economy. The data shows a significant concentration of these symptoms among people of prime working age, so it's hitting the core of the labor force.
Right. And what's the tangible impact on the labor market? Can we quantify the lost work?
Analysts have tried to translate those symptom numbers into actual economic capacity loss. One way is to look at the number of people reporting that long COVID significantly limits their day-to-day activities. Aggregating this suggests an impact equivalent to around 110,000 full-time workers being permanently unable to work due to these ongoing health issues.
110,000 people effectively removed from the workforce potential.
Yes. And another way to look at it is lost hours. Estimates suggest long COVID could be responsible for something like 4.4 million fewer working hours taking place each week across the UK economy.
4 million hours a week. That's a huge amount of lost potential activity.
It really is. And it's not just about reduced hours or productivity for those still in work. There's also the impact of people leaving the workforce entirely.
Dropping out altogether because they can't manage work anymore.
Exactly. The most severe consequence. Some analysis suggests that approximately 80,000 people might have left employment completely due to long COVID since the pandemic started.
80,000 people. Not just temporarily off sick, but gone from the labor market.
Potentially permanently, yes.
Um,
Which directly feeds into the UK's wider problems with rising economic inactivity and persistent labor shortages that we've seen post-pandemic.
And that connects right back to the fiscal hole, doesn't it? Those 80,000 people aren't paying income tax or national insurance anymore. They might be drawing benefits instead. It makes closing that 27 billion gap even harder.
Absolutely. The fiscal and productivity scars are deeply intertwined. Fewer workers means a smaller tax base, lower potential growth, which widens the structural deficit.
Okay, so can we put a pound figure on this lost productivity? What's the estimated annual cost to the economy from long COVID's impact on the workforce?
There are a few key estimates from reliable sources. First, looking just at the direct loss of earnings for individuals affected. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, IFS, put that figure at nearly 1.5 billion per year. That's wages not earned, spending not happening, taxes not paid.
1.5 billion just in lost wages. But the total economic hit, the value of the stuff that isn't getting produced or the services not delivered, that's presumably bigger.
Yes, significantly bigger. When studies try to capture the broader economic impact, including the value of lost output, reduce productivity for those still working, but impaired the estimates for the total annual costs start at a minimum of around 5.7 billion.
5.7 billion a year as a conservative baseline.
Yes. Other models, perhaps using slightly different assumptions or capturing wider effects, push that figure higher, potentially up to 8.1 billion annually.
8 billion pounds a year, just evaporating from the economy due to the specific health legacy of the pandemic.
That's the estimate of the annual loss of economic output directly attributable to long COVID's impact on labor.
We need context again. How big is 8 billion pounds a year in the grand scheme of things? What can we compare it to?
It puts it firmly in the territory of major established public health burdens that policymakers are used to dealing with. For instance, that upper estimate of 8.1 billion is remarkably close to the widely cited annual cost of stroke to the UK economy, which is around 9 billion or so.
Wow, so long COVID, the economic damage is potentially on par with stroke.
In terms of annual lost output, the figures are certainly comparable based on these studies. It's also, say, roughly half the estimated annual cost of dealing with cancer in the UK.
That really lands the significance. It's not a niche issue. It's a major multi-billion pound structural drag on the economy that needs to be factored into all future planning.
It absolutely has to be seen that way. It demands serious policy attention, just like any other major chronic health condition with significant economic consequences.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that this didn't just appear out of nowhere. Was the UK workforce particularly vulnerable to this kind of shock?
That's a really important point. The pandemic didn't necessarily create the problem of working-age ill health in the UK, but it seems to have massively accelerated and exposed a pre-existing vulnerability.
What do you mean?
Even before 2020, there were growing concerns about the number of people out of work due to long-term sickness and disability in the UK. Some estimates put the cost of all working-age ill health preventing work at a staggering 240 billion to 330 billion in lost output back in 2022.
Huge numbers already.
Yes. So the UK had this underlying issue. Then the pandemic hit, and specifically we saw a very sharp rise in the number of people citing long-term sickness as a reason for being economically inactive. That category jumped by over 120,000 people relatively quickly. Long COVID appears to be a major driver of that specific increase.
So the pandemic, and long COVID in particular, poured fuel on an existing fire, exacerbated a structural weakness in the nation's health capital.
It seems that way. It deepened this pre-existing problem of people being unable to participate fully in the economy due to health reasons.
And that annual output loss, whether it's 5.7 billion or 8.1 billion, directly reduces the tax revenue coming in, making that 27 billion fiscal hole even more challenging to fill. The two scars reinforce each other.
They are absolutely linked. You cannot realistically talk about solving the UK's structural fiscal deficit without also addressing the structural deterioration in workforce health and participation. They are two sides of the same multi-billion-pound annual coin.
All right, this has been quite the journey through the lasting impacts. We've looked at the fiscal side, the debt, the productivity side, the health impacts. Let's try and bring it all together now. Synthesize these different strands to really nail down that final, enduring annual burden. What's the total yearly cost of this pandemic scar?
Okay, let's assemble the core quantifiable components we've identified. The recurring structural cost.
Component number one has to be that mandatory fiscal adjustment, right?
Yes.
The OBR figure.
Yes. Component one, the fiscal drag. That's the permanent structural deficit adjustment the OBR says is required just to stabilize the public finances. We have a hard number for that.
27 billion every year. Policy action required.
Minimum 27 billion pounds. Then we need to add the cost of the economy's weakened productive capacity, mainly due to the health impacts on the workforce we just discussed.
Okay. Component 2, the productivity scarring. This is the lost output from long COVID limiting labor supply. We had a range there,
We did. Let's take the conservative lower bound estimate to be cautious.
which was 5.7 billion per year, minimum.
Minimum 5.7 billion annual loss of national output.
Okay. And then there's the third element, the debt issue, but specifically the volatility aspect.
Right. Component 3, the debt overhang. This is that ongoing, structurally higher cost of servicing the massive debt pile we accumulated, made worse and more volatile by the UK's reliance on those RPI-linked gilts. This one is harder to put a single fixed annual number on because it fluctuates with inflation.
But it definitely adds multiple billions to the annual pressure, especially in uncertain times.
Absolutely. It's a significant recurring vulnerability that adds potentially billions more to the true cost each year, depending on economic conditions.
Okay, so let's focus on the concrete minimums first. We had component 1 and component 2.
27 billion pounds for the fiscal adjustment, plus 5.7 billion for the productivity loss.
That gives us 32.7 billion.
Over 32.7 billion. That represents the absolute rock-solid measurable floor for the annual structural cost directly attributable to the pandemic's legacy, based on the analysis we've discussed.
32.7 billion pounds every year. That's the non-negotiable bill that has to be paid somehow before anything else. Money that isn't available for schools, hospitals, defense, tax cuts, because it's covering this structural damage.
That's the stark reality of it. And remember, that's the minimum.
Right, because we haven't fully costed that volatile debt interest component.
Exactly. When you factor in that persistent variable cost of servicing the structurally higher debt, which, as we saw, can easily swing by several billion pounds a year depending on inflation, the overall annual structural drag is more realistically estimated to be in a range.
And what is that commonly accepted range, based on the sources?
The consensus among analysts looking at these factors post-2022 seems to put the total annual structural drag, the combined fiscal and productivity scarring, including the debt servicing pressure, somewhere in the range of 30 billion to 40 billion per year.
Okay, 30 billion to 40 billion. That's the headline figure for the ongoing annual cost.
That appears to be the right order of magnitude for the long-term, non-transitory economic scarring that policymakers now have to manage year after year.
Let's try and make that 40 billion tangible again for you listening. What else costs that much? What could that money do otherwise? Pick a midpoint, say 35 billion.
Okay, 35 billion a year. Well, contextually, that's roughly the same as the entire annual budget for the Department for Education in England.
The entire education budget, wow.
Or it's pretty comparable to the total yearly cost of running the entire justice system. Police, courts, prisons, the lot.
Okay.
Alternatively, think infrastructure. 35 billion would be enough capital to build, say, 5 or 6 brand new, large, state-of-the-art hospitals every single year.
Right. That makes it incredibly clear. That 40 billion isn't just an abstract number. It's the annual opportunity cost.
Right.
It's the schools not improved, the nurses not hired, the taxes not cut, the investments not made, because that money is effectively pre-allocated to dealing with the pandemic's permanent structural fallout.
Precisely. If those structural weaknesses, the fiscal deficit, the productivity gap could somehow be fixed, it would unlock enormous fiscal firepower for the government to pursue other priorities.
Which underlines why understanding this number and why it exists is so critical for any discussion about the UK's future economic policy. It's the baseline constraint.
It really is. It forces policymakers, or should force them, to stop thinking about these issues as temporary hangovers from the crisis and start seeing them as fundamental structural problems that need deliberate long-term engineering solutions.
So if we accept this 40 billion annual scar is real and persistent, the conversation naturally shifts. What can actually be done about it? The damage is structural, so the solutions have to be structural too, right? Where should the strategic focus be?
Based on the analysis, there are 2 clear strategic priorities that emerge if the goal is to reduce this ongoing burden. The first, and perhaps the one with the most immediate potential for a double win, is tackling that health capital erosion, the productivity drag.
Right. The 5.7 to 8.1 billion pound lost output from long COVID and related ill health affecting the workforce. Why is that the first priority?
Because successfully addressing it doesn't just add billions back to the economy's output potential, the £5.7 BN plus, it also directly helps close the fiscal gap. the 27BN.
Well,
More people working or working more hours means more income tax and national insurance receipts flowing into the Treasury. It also potentially reduces spending on sickness and disability benefits. So fixing the productivity scar helps heal the fiscal scar simultaneously.
okay, makes sense. So what does tackling it actually involve? It sounds complex. We're talking about long-term health conditions.
It requires a really concerted, joined-up effort. It goes beyond just general unemployment support. We're talking about targeted investment from both government and businesses.
What specifically?
Things like much better occupational health services, tailored support programs to help people with chronic conditions manage their symptoms and stay in work or return to work gradually. That might mean more flexible working arrangements becoming standard, better access to specialist clinical care for post-viral conditions, maybe even retraining opportunities.
So a proactive investment in keeping people connected to the labor market despite long-term health challenges.
Exactly. Preventing people from falling out of the workforce in the first place. And helping those who have already left to find a way back, if possible.
And the payoff, if successful, is recovering potentially 8 billion pounds in annual output and chipping away at that 27 billion pound fiscal hole.
That's the potential prize. Every worker helped back, every hour of productivity regained makes a direct contribution to reducing that overall 40 billion annual drag.
Okay, that's strategy one, mend the workforce. What's the second strategic focus? It must be the fiscal side, the debt anchor.
Yes. The second focus has to be on improving the UK's fiscal resilience. Given that the debt to GDP ratio is now structurally much higher, we need to actively manage the risks associated with that, particularly the vulnerability to shocks like inflation.
Which brings us back squarely to those index-linked gilts, the RPI problem.
Absolutely. A key recommendation you see emerging from analysis is the need to seriously evaluate and probably implement strategies to reduce the proportion of UK government debt that's directly linked to RPI inflation.
How could they do that? Can you just change the terms?
Not easily on existing debt, but going forward, they could issue less index-linked debt relative to conventional debt. They could explore potentially buying back some of the existing index-linked gilts, perhaps funded by issuing new conventional gilts, maybe look at linking any new inflation-proof debt to CPI instead of RPI, which is generally lower and less volatile.
Okay, so actively managing the structure of the national debt to make it less sensitive to inflation spikes.
Precisely. It's about reducing that specific vulnerability that cost the Treasury so dearly during the recent inflationary period.
And the benefit of doing that.
It would make the UK's annual debt servicing costs much less volatile and more predictable. It would remove that unpredictable multi-billion-pound kicker we talked about, making long-term fiscal planning much more stable and reducing the risk of sudden budget shocks. It helps stabilize one key component of that overall annual drag.
Okay, so fix the workforce health issues and fix the debt structure vulnerability. But ultimately, doesn't the big 27 billion structural hole still need to be closed directly?
Yes. Those two strategies help, but the underlying OBR-identified gap of 27 billion remains the central challenge. Closing that requires a combination of two things over the long term.
Which are?
First, sustain discipline on public spending, ensuring that the temporary emergency-level spending from the pandemic doesn't become permanently baked into departmental budgets without justification, making tough choices about priorities.
Okay, spending control. And second,
And arguably more importantly for the long run, is successfully implementing policies that genuinely raise the UK's underlying potential growth rate. Targeted investments in skills, infrastructure, innovation, things that make the economy permanently more productive.
because higher growth means higher tax revenues automatically.
Exactly. If you can lift the economy's sustainable growth trajectory above the rather sluggish path currently forecast by the OBR, then that 27 billion cap starts to shrink naturally over time as tax receipts outperform expectations. Without that higher structural growth, you're basically stuck having to find that 27 billion pound through politically painful spending cuts or tax rises year after year.
That definitely sounds like a long-term project.
Yeah.
Requires political will across potentially multiple governments.
It's undoubtedly a multi-decade challenge to fully address these structural scars. There are no quick fixes.
Yeah.
Hashtag outro.
Well, what we've really unpacked today, I think, is that while the initial pandemic shock involved those eye-watering figures in the hundreds of billions, the truly significant cost, the one we're living with now, is this permanent structural scarring.
That's the key takeaway. It's this persistent, recurring 30 billion to 40 billion annual burden on the UK economy, driven by that baseline 27 billion fiscal adjustment needed and significantly compounded by those billions in lost output every year from the erosion of our national health capital.
And we established earlier that the initial policy response, the lockdown, while costly upfront, likely avoided an even bigger catastrophe valued at over 300 billion. So that choice seems, in hindsight, economically rational within its own context.
Yes, the immediate crisis management seems justifiable by the numbers presented.
But the consequence of that management, combined with the virus itself, is this 30–40 billion annual bill. And it starkly exposed these underlying weaknesses in our public finances structure and, critically, in the health and resilience of our working-age population.
They were perhaps vulnerabilities before, but the crisis amplified them dramatically.
Which leaves us, and leaves you listening, with a pretty challenging final thought, doesn't it?
I think it does. The emergency phase, the scramble to respond, that's long gone. But this structural bill, this 30–40 billion, it effectively lands on the doormat every January 1st.
Year after year.
Year after year. So the real question now, perhaps, is, given that we know the annual price tag, how long will it take for policymakers, for society maybe, to fully pivot, to shift focus completely away from just reacting to the echoes of the emergency and towards the hard, long-term work of permanently fixing those fundamental structural weaknesses that the crisis laid bare?
Because the choice now isn't about saving lives in that immediate sense anymore. It's about whether we're willing to make the sustained investments and reforms needed to actually heal these economic scars, or if we just resign ourselves to paying this 30–40 billion price indefinitely.
That seems to be the core strategic choice facing the UK for the foreseeable future. How do we stop paying the bill and start repairing the foundations? Something for you to mull over.